Tier lists are kinda funny, aren't they? Oh, this character is better than this character. He's more likely to win tournaments. I think all of us can agree that a competitive tier list is never gonna be accurate to a character's in-universe power level. I'm pretty sure UI Goku should be at the top. Genshin Impact similarly is no stranger to tier lists of their own. And obviously, they aren't exactly lore accurate either. Like, I'm pretty sure Mr. Persona non grata should be better than a C tier. And if you look at the very bottom of the tier list, you see her. Amber. Considered one of, if not the worst character in the game. The major reason for this thought process is because she does not play a clear role. Does she deal insane damage? No. Does she deal a lot of supporting damage? No. Does she give insane buffs to the team? No! Amber is a character who just doesn't show a lot of potency in the game. Intriguingly, people are under the belief that Amber is one of the few characters whose power in the world is pretty accurate to her power in the game. She just isn't that strong. I detest that notion. Milestones. They are a pretty good gauge for a person's potential, especially when there's another character with similar milestones, as they act as a sort of path to figure out how strong the other's potential could be. Amber's story path on power is surprisingly really close to Diluc, who's currently one of the strongest humans in Genshin Impact in its entirety. Like, we are talking about a character who manifested his vision at age 10, joined the Knights of Favonius at the same age, became a captain of his own team at age 12, fought 2 Fatui Harbingers and lived at the age of 19, became so skillful with a delusion that he faces none of its drawbacks, was willing to face off against Dottore, one of if not the strongest Harbinger at around the age of 21, was considered for leader of Mondstadt only to not have it because he turned it down, and is now in his early 20s protecting his homeland from the shadows like he is Batman. And that is not a joke, he is called the Dark Knight. And that is just the tip of the iceberg, like how he's in possession of the Wolf's Gravestone, one of the most sacred weapons in the series and implied to hold the power of Boreas, the Wolf of the North. Now, Amber is still very much in her infancy. She's most likely around the age of 18, so it makes more sense to show how surprisingly impressive she is when compared to Diluc at that same age. So why not look through her story? Amber was born only knowing her grandfather. Amber's grandfather was once a mercenary from Liyue who, after a failed mission, was saved by the Knights of Favonius. Out of shame for failing his mission and gratitude towards the Knights, he decided to stay in Mondstadt. During his time in Mondstadt, he would be the founder of the Outrider division in the Knights of Favonius and trained all of its members. Eventually, he would fall in love and soon get a granddaughter with Amber, who ever since she was a kid, always looked up to him. She would be found watching him teach the Outriders and then practice those same teachings late at night out on the yard. Amber's grandfather had pride in his granddaughter for wanting to learn, and decided to teach her everything he knew, something important to keep in mind. One day, Amber's grandfather would suddenly disappear from Mondstadt without a trace, and Amber would find herself joining the Outriders division shortly after. However, due to his leave, the Outriders would soon move to different divisions in the Knights or resign, with Amber remaining as the only Outrider, where in spite of being the sole one, she goes out of her way to do her duties every day. Soon, she finds her grandfather's book of old fables, and reading through them, realized that the one thing she was missing wasn't her grandfather, but was the ability to think and be courageous without him, which causes her to manifest her vision. 3 years later, she would meet Kale, a young girl who was being targeted by the Fatui. Amber, being one of her closest friends, tasks it upon herself to help the girl learn to find joy in her life, while also wishing to help through her struggles. This wish leads to her fighting against Barnabas, a Fatui who's Dottore's subordinate, who, if you remember, is one of the most strongest humans in the world. A fight that she ultimately wins. Eventually, a year after, she meets the Traveler and begins to help them on their journey to find their sister. A pretty good story so far, and on its own doesn't sound nearly as impressive as the milestones I mentioned for Diluc. And that's because I didn't contextualize the milestones given to Amber. First, let's start off with the ages. It's generally accepted that you meet Amber at age 18 in the game. Her grandfather was said to have left 4 years from the events of the game. This means that Amber was around 14 years old when she became a knight, namely an Outrider. And I feel like it's incredibly important to contextualize just how impressive that is. While yes, Diluc became a knight at the age of 10, this recruitment was done when he gained his vision, which aided in his quick progress in becoming a knight. Amber was able to achieve the same feat without her vision. In fact, if you are paying attention to the story properly, Amber was taught everything her grandfather knows, which means by the time he left, Amber had all his training under her belt to become a knight. Furthermore, Eula is actually noted for having taken mentorship under Amber's granddad, and she's a woman whose strength and caliber as a knight is compared to Jean, who's the acting leader of Mondstadt. Eula is a Claymore user, which means that Amber's grandfather was a Claymore teacher, meaning Amber is not only really proficient with a bow, she's really proficient with a Claymore too, potentially knowing as much as Eula does. That means when Amber joined the Knights, she compensated for her lack of vision by being much more skillful with weapons. And this is further implied by the fact that she maintained her solo Outrider position for a long while. Reminder, Amber got her vision much after her grandfather left, meaning that for a good while, Amber was doing Outrider stuff without a vision, and depending on the Genshin timeline events, Amber could have been doing this for either 1 year or 3 years, by herself. And for context on why that's impressive, it's because an Outrider's task is to be a scout, clear pathways and defeat enemies for people and movers. Depending on what that route is, Amber wouldn't just be fighting her usual Hilichurl and crossbow Hilichurl, she can find herself facing Minichurls, Whopper Flowers on the low end, and on the high end, Ruin Mechs, Abyss Hounds, and Eye of the Storms. This is without a vision. That means sure, Amber only obtained the Knight position at age 14, but in that age, Amber has regularly faced threats that you would expect people with actual visions to face. Remember, she's the only Outrider, so there's a very high likelihood she has faced these creatures and for the sake of the job, has won. So while Diluc has the 10-year-old feat, Amber's 14-year-old feat can be considered just as impressive, as Diluc had actual superpowers to do the night work and Amber did not have those same powers to aid her. Then comes her fight against Barnabas. This point in the story, Amber did have her vision. However, she was facing a subordinate to the Harbinger, and he had something known as god residue within him, literally the remains of an actual god injected into his body, that he uses at its absolute fullest against Amber in this fight. There was deadass of phase 1 and phase 2 for this fight, and Amber won. Now I wouldn't personally say this, but if you want to equate this to Amber being god level, I'm not gonna stop you. Diluc did aid Amber in setting her up for the finishing blow, but doesn't deny the fact that Amber basically did most of the heavy lifting in this fight. Now obviously Amber isn't god level for beating an opponent like this, but I don't think I'm pushing it by that much when I say this borderlines her on Harbinger level. And keep in mind, Diluc himself was most likely borderlining that same level at the same age. And what made it even more insane is that Diluc was most likely using Wolf's Gravestone for his fight against the two Harbingers. Amber used the Hunter's Bow, a 1-star weapon, literally the weakest bow both in-game and in lore, and she won the fight. She was literally fighting God Remains with a handicap, and still somehow came out of that whole thing victorious. This Amber is 17. If you were to accept the belief that Diluc in the game is 22 years old, his own Harbinger feat is at 19. Do you see where I'm going with this? Amber's skill level is surprisingly a close match to Diluc at similar ages, having milestones that when compared to each other are really impressive. If Amber got her hands on a sacred bow, you could actually make an argument that Amber would have been on the same level or beyond Diluc's level. Heck, she might actually already have access to a sacred weapon with the Song of Broken Pines. That weapon is implied to be made by the God of Wind. Remember, Amber can use Claymore weapons, which means that Eula's weapon is very usable by her. This doesn't even get into how insane Amber's own Baron Bunny could have been, with a story existing about how Miss Alice once turned Baron Bunny into a nuke so powerful, it actually just blew up a mountain. Amber has a mountain nuke in her arsenal that she just never uses. All of this being said, look at these same milestones now back to back. We are genuinely looking at a character who at Diluc's age could become strong enough to be her own complete guardian of Mondstadt, the same way Diluc is. She's honestly just 3 more years off from it. Now Genshin could make a new Amber build with this in mind. I want Claymore Amber, please, let me see how she fights with it. But if we were to actually put her in a tier list, Amber is honestly beating out a vast majority of the cast. Like, the only people Amber doesn't have much of a shot against are the characters who actually tested themselves against gods. A quick gauntlet round where we put Amber in Mondstadt and see how far she can climb up the ladder until she just can't anymore. Let's begin. I do have my own personal thoughts where each character is power level wise, but most of this is based on what I feel like they're supposed to be rather than actual indicative lore and proof. So let's get started, eh? Amber clears out nearly half of Mondstadt without much effort. However, this is mostly because Amber's competition isn't all that impressive. For example, Barbara and Sucrose, 2 characters who barely fight. Barbara might be interesting, as she is apparently good with a sword too, along with her catalyst, but her only real feat is beating treasure hoarders, and treasure hoarders are the literal fodder of Genshin. They are nothing. And if that wasn't bad enough, her statement of knowing how to use a sword came with a further statement of her not even being able to keep pace with Jean's own skill, and that Barbara is technically a failed knight. So yeah, these two aren't going to stand much of a chance against Amber. And then there's Diona, who actually does have some feats to her, considering she is a hunter. However, she's considered only second to her father, the best hunter in Springvale, who doesn't have a vision. We already talked about how Amber is incredibly potent without a vision, and that her feats without them make her insanely physically gifted, which means this matchup would also be a win. Amber may not even need her vision to beat Diona, not like it would matter anyway, considering her Pyro vision takes priority over Cryo. I also think it goes without saying that Mika isn't winning either. Yes, he knows how to use lance, bows, and catalysts, but he also directly stated to answer to Eula, meaning he's not as strong as her, and since Eula and Amber are pretty comparable to each other, Mika would not be winning this fight, which leaves Bennett and Fischl, part of the Adventurers Guild. That wouldn't mean that these characters aren't impressive though. For example, Bennett was able to overpower Albedo's cryomancy, though that being said, there was an elemental advantage, and it was revealed later on that it was a giant whopper flower taking the form of Albedo. So this feat doesn't nearly hold as much weight as one would expect, and hence wouldn't scale to the same impressiveness that Amber has, with Fischl being an investigator also meaning that she doesn't have the necessary combat experience that someone like Amber would have. The reason I speedrun these specific characters from Mondstadt is because they're on the weaker side of the nation, and they don't really have proper win conditions to beat Amber. Here onwards though, it gets interesting. Noelle is interesting because for all intents and purposes, she is strong enough to be a knight. She just isn't allowed to be one because Miss Jean worries that the woman will work herself to death. That being said, Noelle does have a huge advantage against Amber, and that's her insane physical strength. If it wasn't for Shenhe, Noelle would just be the physically strongest human in the series. Her most well-known physical feat being in her own hangout quest, where she was able to shatter a giant boulder covering a path with her brute strength and her brute strength alone. Which means that this fight kind of falls down to a classic speed versus power debate. Since something I didn't mention but should be brought up is that Amber is considered very agile in Mondstadt. That being said though, while Amber isn't physically stronger than Noelle, she has a pretty easy answer to her. Noelle's weapon is a claymore, which means up close and personal is her form of combat, which is directly countered by how Amber fights. With her preference being a bow, Amber can simply use her speed and completely zone out Noelle. Noelle is also noted for being someone who needs time to mature as a knight too, which means her battle strategy won't be as potent as Amber's. Not to say Noelle doesn't have workarounds, since her battle style revolves around self-healing, shielding, and massive AoE, Noelle could compensate for her lack of distance by just straight up increasing the range of her blade, but these workarounds would have to be thought of for one thing. And as stated before, Noelle isn't noted for having good strategy, and Amber can very easily overcome it by using her better agility and zone her out even more. So while Noelle would be giving her a more difficult time, unless she galaxy brains this fight, it goes to Amber, though it's a low diff victory. Rosaria would be a decent problem, but she doesn't have feats, which means that we have to work with what the game has provided us. Rosaria was raised by bandits. While that does mean her skill is left to be questioned, her cunning nature isn't. So while you can very easily make the argument that Amber has higher skill than Rosaria, Rosaria might be more battle smart than her, and unlike Amber, she's more than willing to go for the kill in a fight. Now of course, bloodlust doesn't always mean stronger. There are plenty of characters who don't hold back but aren't intending on going for the kill either. Amber's a good example herself with her fight against Barnabas and how that went for her. That being said though, even if there was a potential intelligence advantage, Amber has both the skill advantage and an elemental advantage over her. So this would be mid difficulty due to the extra smarts Amber needs to manage against Rosaria's more dirty tactics. But when it comes to fist, Amber wouldn't have much issue to face off against her. Razor might actually be very difficult for her. Razor is another character noted for his agility. In fact, I would even say he has more to direct him as being faster than Amber. On top of that, while Amber was taught Claymore and Bow from her grandfather, Razor was taught Claymore from Varka himself, the former leader of Mondstadt. And as if that wasn't enough, Razor has surprisingly effective feats of his own. He faces Abyss Hounds on the regular and wins, and even took out an Abyss Herald by himself, who are comparable to most leader characters in the game. Razor also runs on instinct in combat a lot, since he's raised by Boreas too, the Wolf of the North. Razor is surprisingly strong. Amber's victory would be a high diff easily. Now, giving context for the Herald feat, Boreas was helping him and the Traveler joins at some point too. But even still, having greater agility than Amber means it'll be a struggle for her to use a bow, as Razor can close the distance pretty effectively, and she won't be as good as Razor at using claymores since Razor's mentor is much better at using it than Amber was. They both have good win conditions, that being said. Razor can beat Amber by constantly rushing at her until she can't manage anymore, or Amber uses her endurance and stamina and try to outlast Razor defensively. Amber can also switch between long range and short range to better pull off the defense. And even still, she has done close range combat with just a bow. Not to mention, Amber's own attack potency should be considered better than Razor even with a claymore, since her attack potency was able to take out creatures with god remains in their body. Razor's only real advantage is being more agile and having better close quarters. Amber still has better long range, better strength, and better battle smarts than him. So even though Razor's combat style does directly counter Amber's approach to combat, she has enough advantages over Razor to say that she would win in a fight against him. But this would be a high difficulty fight for her. Eula and Jean is most likely her uppermost limit. Even though feat wise she still has them beat in power and maybe speed, those two characters are more battle smart and more experienced than Amber. In fact, you can take the statement with a grain of salt, but Paimon and Traveler both see Jean and Diluc as around the same level of power. Now obviously the validity of the statement is left to be questioned, but the fact that Jean even has that comparison and then is stated to be an equal to Eula puts the perspective that these two characters might be Amber's complete human limit in combat. Which also means that characters around their level with Albedo, Klee, Kaya, Diluc, Lisa wouldn't be opponents they could beat. Now, Amber might be able to beat Kaya. You can make an argument for that since in the comic, Amber was able to intercept one of Kaya's attacks and she does have an elemental advantage, but that's as far as she goes. The fact that her human limit is against people who are complete adults now and leaders, Amber having still not reached their age, means that given just the extra few years, she should be well surpassing most of the characters with time. And reminder that most of the matchups keeps in mind Amber's feats, all of which are with a nerfed Amber since it took place a year ago. Obviously Amber got stronger, but also cause Amber did all these feats with a regular bow. That's still close to half of the Mondstadt roster, which is endlessly impressive. Invest in Amber stocks now.